I'm John Batchelor. This is the John Batchelor Show. It's a pleasure to welcome Sohrab Ahmari to my studio. Sohrab is assistant books editor at the Wall Street Journal, but he also writes extremely trenchant columns about Iran. Sohrab was born in Iran, and he very carefully explicates details of Iran that are very well known if you have the Farsi, but are less well known if you're having to see this through a glass darkly of all these years of tangled relationships. Sohrab, a very good evening to you, and thank you for this. Your most recent column that is a fascination is about a man named Hassan Rohani, who is now the elected president of Iran, taking Ahmadinejad's place. Rohani is a cleric, but you identify him as a long-standing agent of the Iranian Revolution, the terror part of the revolution. He served in the 1990s and before that as part of a special affairs committee for the supreme leader. What was that?
The Special Affairs Committee was, and thank you for having me, John, the Special Affairs Committee was a body that was set up right after Ayatollah Khomeini died to take care of the regime's external enemies. Primarily, that was during the 90s to essentially to liquidate the opposition abroad. And each member of the committee would be assigned a specific member of the opposition. And if decision was made by the new supreme leader, Khamenei, who's the current supreme leader, to eliminate that person, then that's, they pursued that, and there's a number of people who died in Germany, in France, and elsewhere.
What you're talking about is an assassination committee, is that correct?
That's right.
And we're looking at an assassination committee that was set up on purpose to identify targets and to then give the orders to assassins, cutouts, to kill them. And Rohani was on this committee in the 1990s?
That's right.
All right. There are a number of assassinations, infamous assassinations in Europe in the 1990s, and there was the attack in Buenos Aires in the 1990s. There's an outstanding Interpol warrant for a number of significant figures in the Iranian Revolution having to do with Buenos Aires and the attack on the Israeli embassy 2 years before. Is Rohani part of that investigation?
Rohani is not, he's not been indicted directly, but he's been named in the indictment by the prosecutor Nisman, who
Alberto Nisman, the Argentine special prosecutor investigating the attacks.
That's right. And so, I mean, what's interesting about that is that the Argentinian government now, because it's trying to take an approach of rapprochement with the Iranian regime, is trying to downplay the fact that in their own official documents, Mr. Rohani is named as having been involved in this committee.
You also cite in your piece in the Wall Street Journal about assassinations in Europe. This is a man who was assassinated in France, is that correct? And you believe that he was a target of this special committee and that they hired an assassin and sent him into France. Do the French investigators continue to believe that there's a solution to this crime that leads back to the special committee?
They do. The French judge that investigated that case concluded that this was an act of terror by the Iranian regime to try to silence its opponents abroad, and to stifle, the dissidents and the exiled community that had found some measure of freedom of expression, of trying to oppose the regime back home. And to spread fear through that community, and he directly indicted the Iranian regime.
This is Reza Mazluman.
Yeah.
Mazluman.
Yeah.
He was the victim, and is Rohani named in that investigation?
He's not directly named in that investigation.
But the committee is investigating.
The committee is, of which he was a member during that period.
All right. Now we've set up the problem, and I've done the easy part here. Now I'm going to be difficult. Can you explain how it is that this man, who is linked to terror on 2 continents now, and probably more, is the president of Iran? How does that help the supreme leader to put a man in who's qualified by his past?
A number of ways. Rohani has a reputation, at least abroad, as someone who is a quote-unquote moderate. Now, by what standard of moderation? Right. Well, you have to really lower the bar for Rohani to count as a moderate. Right. This was also a gentleman who, in 1995, actually, I found a clipping from a major newspaper in Iran in which he said, quote, he was speaking to a group of students. He said, quote, the beautiful cry of death to America unites our nation. So, I mean, if that's a moderate, I would like to see who an immoderate Iranian regime official is.
Complication.
Right.
Rafsanjani is also named in the Buenos Aires attack.
Yeah.
And Rafsanjani was president of Iran during these 30 years since the revolution, 34 years now. My information is that Rohani was a lieutenant of Rafsanjani. I almost use the word stooge, but there's no reason. I can be diplomatic here.
Sure.
Was one of Rafsanjani's lieutenants. Now, Rafsanjani and the supreme leader, there's a rivalry there, long-standing. So how does it help the supreme leader to have a lieutenant, a subordinate from another camp, now the president of Iran?
It helps him by allowing him to have a yes man who will, take the blame for all the catastrophes to come, because the Iranian economy is still a wreck. And if Rouhani was to genuinely try to fix that problem, he would actually have to make peace with the West and actually come clean on the nuclear program and comply with Iran's international obligations. By having someone who can't do that and yet is willing to be the fall guy for all the failures that result from that is very useful to the supreme leader, because it allows him to extricate himself from the suffering that the Iranian people are going to go through.
All right, so we've got a fall guy here. Catherine Ashton, the European Union's Minister of Foreign Affairs, has already spoken positively of new dialogue with Rouhani. Is he good at that sort of thing? Delaying, wandering around the park, forever drawing out conversation?
He's far better than Ahmadinejad was.
Yeah.
The problem with Ahmadinejad was he was too blunt. He would say things like, he wants to wipe out the Jewish state.
Well, he was hallucinatory as well.
Right. Whereas with Rouhani, you have someone, he's what you call a smiling mullah. He talks about dialogue among the civilizations. He was charming enough for Jack Straw and others to call him the diplomatic sheikh. But if you listen to what he was saying at the time to domestic audiences, and even what he was saying just a few months ago during the so-called campaign period inside the country leading up to the election, what he was saying is we were good at deceiving the West. Our language, our tone was more conciliatory, but at the same time we were pushing forward on a number of fronts. They managed, for example, to change the definition of what suspension means. Suspension is an international obligation under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. They managed to make it a temporary measure that they would do while they were doing all sorts of they're pushing on other fronts and building up their nuclear infrastructure. But they could suspend temporarily as a trust-building measure rather than actually complying in good faith.
Right now, do you expect Rouhani to change course for Iran, or do you expect to continue the continued confrontation and belligerence?
I think we're going to see a changed tone, but as in terms of concrete policies, in terms of whether they're going to continue supporting the Syrian regime and underwriting the butchery that's going on in Syria, that will go on. In terms of nuclear trickery, that will go on. And in terms of domestic politics, you'll see maybe a little bit of breathing room allowed to the Iranian people as a reward for having participated in the election. But on the whole, I don't think you'll see a substantive change. This regime is not reformable from my perspective.
Sohrab Ahmari, the books editor at the Wall Street Journal, writing most recently of the new president of Iran, Hassan Rouhani. I'm John Batchelor. This is The John Batchelor Show.